Today is the July 18th deadline for the Microsoft acquisition of Activision Blizzard, and it's probably not going to close today, but it does seem like it will happen probably in a few days or maybe a week. But what we can say right now is that after 18 long months, Sony has reluctantly signed an agreement with Microsoft for 10 years to secure Call of Duty on PlayStation. So let's talk about the deal, how this all played out, clear up some misconceptions, and also talk about what this means for Sony now moving forward. So like I just mentioned, today is the deadline, and they're probably not going to close because they were getting way too close to this deadline without solving the CMA problem. So what we know right now is that Microsoft and the CMA are working something out while the Competition Appeal Tribunal agreed to pause the appeal process. And Bloomberg is reporting that Microsoft and Activision are not going to walk away from the deal, so despite that being a possibility once the deadline is up, it seems like they're close enough as is, so they're just agreeing to a brief extension, and they'll try and get this all sorted out. And the big news here is that what we saw a few days ago is that Sony, after an 18-month, battle, as it were, a reluctance to agree to this and pushing back with regulators, they finally, at the last minute, agreed to a Call of Duty deal where it's a 10-year agreement for only the Call of Duty franchise, and PlayStation is finally on board, probably because this is going to go through. You might as well get something on paper. So that's what we're going to talk about, is that we now have a clear picture on the 18-month negotiations between Sony and Microsoft, or I guess what we should say is a lack thereof. So I'm seeing a lot of confusion on what was said, what was offered, when this was discussed, and it is kind of a pain to, go through all this stuff again. So that's what we'll do. We'll get you brought up to speed and clarify exactly what was said and what was offered and what Sony initially, eventually agreed on. So going back to January 2022, when the acquisition was announced, Jim Ryan said in an email to a former Sony Computer Entertainment CEO that he doesn't think this is an exclusivity play at all. They're thinking bigger than that, and that he's pretty sure they will continue to see COD on PlayStation for many years to come. So that was his initial response. He wasn't concerned. Around this time, Phil Spencer and Satya Nadella were making calls to Sony leadership, and those calls were initially fine. Everyone seemed receptive. And if we jump to September 2022, that's when Phil Spencer said they made a contract offer in January. So that was about Call of Duty feature and content parity for, quote, at least several more years beyond the current Sony contract, an offer that goes well beyond typical gaming industry agreements. So that was the first offer in January. Call of Duty feature and content parity. That's all we knew at the time, but in recent days we know that original January 31st offer was for Call of Duty and other IP. And so going back to September, that's where we had that public spat where Jim Ryan responded by providing a quote to GamesIndustry.biz where he called the offer inadequate, saying it was only for 3 more years. And then he said he thought this was a private matter, but Phil Spencer brought this into the public forum, and that's when that whole thing took place. Now, once the regulatory process kicked off, the very first time we saw Sony push back on the deal publicly is when Brazil's CADE published responses from third parties in May 2022. That's where Sony began their arguments about COD's importance, Game Pass, and yada yada, all that stuff. We had so many arguments back and forth between Sony and Microsoft and regulators. That's when the CMA got involved, so there's a lot of that. We don't have to go over any of that stuff again, but it was from January to August where a lot of the negotiating happened. And as we saw from Jim Ryan's deposition during the FTC trial, he said he became alarmed about the deal in August because of an email from Phil Spencer. So on May 26th, Jim Ryan sent this email to Phil where he says Microsoft's original proposal left him with serious concerns. It seems this email references a counter-proposal Sony made that Microsoft deemed unusual. So this email is explaining further what Sony is looking for, which is broader long-term guarantees for Call of Duty and all Activision content, irrespective of original release dates. or whether they are classified as a part of a certain franchise. More or less, he's looking for Activision Blizzard to continue operating how one would expect pre-acquisition. Like, most would not question if the next Call of Duty is coming to PS5, or the next Spyro, or even if Activision has a new IP. Most would normally assume those will ship on PlayStation, so that's what Jim is looking for. That, and also protections against unequal treatment via subscription services. Another part of their proposal is that Sony would end their marketing agreements with Activision post-merger, and Jim also mentions Bethesda content here, so it does seem like earlier discussions were about trying to potentially work something out for that as well. Then we get to Phil's email on August 26th, 2022. It's not that long because Phil is shooting down Jim's proposals and falling back on their original January 31st offer. So there was basically zero negotiating actually happening during most of this process, with Phil Spencer saying it's hard to align with those principles from Jim Ryan's email, considering Sony's leading role in the market. The offer is, and always was, existing and future versions of Call of Duty and any other current Activision franchise through December 31st, 2027. That's the 3-year deal that Jim Ryan deemed inadequate, which that email also included a list of games that would remain on PlayStation, and at least from Jim Ryan's deposition, he confirms it was not all games, saying it had Overwatch but not Overwatch 2 on there as an example. So then that brings us to the September spat between Phil and Jim Ryan, where they made it public, and then by November 2022, we were hearing that Microsoft began offering 10-year deals, so there was a lot more regulatory scrutiny. Sony still wasn't budging, and then they seemed more confident that the deal might actually get blocked, and so that's why they weren't signing. And that brings us to July 16th, days before the deadline for the deal. 18 months later, PlayStation chose to sign a 10-year agreement for Call of Duty. All we know is that it's 10 years and only for Call of Duty. Now, it should go without saying, Sony did not want to sign that. You know what I mean? They came in at the last minute. Okay, it's not going to get blocked. It's going to go through. We might as well, on paper, have something that's going to guarantee us this, highly profitable, big revenue driver for the PlayStation business that comes out every year. We might as well secure that before this thing goes through. And they did. And they were put in a tough spot. Obviously they did feel like, hey, maybe we can get this thing to be blocked. We can come out and be a proponent of why this is anti-competitive and all that. We saw the entire 18-month process, obviously. But that is the deal they settled on. And, that's one angle I think we can acknowledge right away is that, for a lot of people during this entire thing, it was always a matter of why does Microsoft even have to offer Sony something? But, they do have an obligation to try and work something out. We saw on day one, they called Sony leadership to say, hey, we're looking to keep Call of Duty on PlayStation. You shouldn't have to worry and this and that. But, it's a matter of this is such a massive deal. It's one of the biggest in the tech industry in years. So it is something where we saw towards the end, it was those agreements and commitments that got them through those remaining regulatory bodies that were pushing back, right? With the CMA, where it might finally, they might finally have a path there, although that might still include a structural remedy. But the EU, it was all those commitments. The FTC with the trial, the judge ruled, hey, it's because of all those commitments they made with Nintendo, Nvidia, the public statements under oath about how they want to keep shipping the game on PlayStation. It was those commitments. And so that's why those definitely were happening, and they did have to talk with Sony. And this goes back to the various Fridays on LTPS where we were covering this deal. And I remember very clearly mentioning how that there's definitely negotiations happening, but we don't know what it looks like. Sony could be asking for crazy X, Y, and Z things, and Microsoft is going to be unwilling to agree to those because for as much as they want the deal to go through, they're not going to agree to it if they don't have all this upside to the deal. So, that is where they had a hard cutoff. Hey, we're giving you this 3-year thing, and they were not budging for quite a while until it turned into, 10 years for only Call of Duty, right? So They weren't budging on that. We also saw with the CMA, they were not willing to humor a structural remedy of divesting Activision Blizzard, because that was another rhetoric going on, is that, this acquisition is primarily about mobile, and it can be primarily about mobile, but they are still largely driven by the entire Activision Blizzard King business. So if they really wanted just mobile, they would divest Activision Blizzard so they can get over the CMA hurdle, right? But that was not the case. They figured we can get the whole thing and have our cake and eat it too, as we say, and that's what it boils down to, right? I mean, looking back at the one deal that was the first one they offered Sony, the January 31st one, so that's been the big conversation the past few days, that, okay, so Sony really only had two options here, right? Which is either 3 years for Call of Duty and other Activision properties, all as they say, but we saw from the deposition that it did not include Overwatch 2, so we don't really know what exactly was going on there, but it presumably included a lot of Activision properties. 3 years for that, or 10 years of Call of Duty. Now, regardless of how you feel as a consumer, the right choice for Sony was Call of Duty. I mean, it was always kind of a frustrating thing to see this whole process play out, and it's like, okay, Call of Duty, it makes a lot of money, yes. But hey, what about Overwatch, Diablo, Tony Hawk, Spyro, Crash? I mean, there are all those other properties, but they don't make nearly as much money as Call of Duty, right? So, if you're Sony, you're going to be picking 10 years of Call of Duty every single time, more or less, right? And so that's actually why I agree with Jim Ryan about the 3-year inadequate deal. I mean, 3 years for Call of Duty and other properties. The other properties, I mean, for 3 years, that really doesn't amount to anything, because that's going to be largely dependent on those games, in terms of their release slate, how far along they are in development, and when they're planned to come out. So that doesn't really mean you're going to get 3 years of new Tony Hawk, Crash, and Spyro games. That's if they come out. So, that wasn't really a good guarantee at all. I mean, they could ship something in 2026. Okay, cool. It has to come out on PlayStation. But the second they start making something that's not going to be scheduled to release until, say, 2028, there's nothing on paper that guarantees a PlayStation release. That's just not a whole lot of time, and that does coincide with new platforms coming out. So by the time PlayStation 6 rolls around, Sony is in a very tough spot of losing all Activision Blizzard content. You know what I mean? All of it. So the 10-year deal was the one Sony should have taken, and they did reluctantly. But what does this mean now for the future of PlayStation? Well, the good news is that we have an idea of what to expect, right? I mean, that was the question mark I talked about last week, is that once this deal closes, it's not over, it's the beginning, because now we have to go through years of, Activision Blizzard releases, and we don't know what's coming and what's not. But thankfully, we do have some clarity on that. 10 years, Call of Duty, and anything else, I don't even know if debatable is the right word here, because it would be in Microsoft's best interest to not release things on PlayStation. Why would they? They have no obligation. I mean, they have said before that every game is a case-by-case basis, but, they're a platform holder. They want to ship all these games on Game Pass day and date and drive more consumers to the Xbox business. So I would say probably expect all those IP to be Microsoft properties from this point forward. Maybe there could be negotiations. Maybe Sony could work something out. I don't really know. I mean, this stuff is fresh, but historically, looking at how Microsoft has handled all this stuff before, how they handled Bethesda, walking into Arcane and saying there's no more Redfall for PS5, Starfield very much coming to PlayStation 5. Why would it not? But that game is not coming over either. So I would presume that's likely what's going to happen here. But be that as it may, this is why Sony should always be careful of Microsoft. They have a ton of buying power. This is not the end, as they say, right? The consolidation is going to keep going on. Not even going to speculate there because obviously there's a lot that could be said about that. But Sony is in what I have always felt is a defensive position. They don't have the capital Microsoft has, right? So while Sony has always gotten this reputation for being the big, bad, exclusive, aggressive monster here, yeah, they do a bunch of timed exclusive agreements and things like that, but they can't really do what Microsoft is doing. You know, Sony has historically just bought these smaller studios that they've always been contracting out to make PlayStation games anyway, which have never had any sort of bearing on the Xbox business. So, you know, they do operate differently. And now Sony is getting into a position of, you know, I've said this before, but it's like if they're going to start going into that territory of picking up a publisher or just buying more studios in general, which would be, I'd say, uncharacteristic of how they normally acquire studios, it almost feels like that would be more of a defensive play than an offensive one, if that makes sense, right? More to secure their own future, which Microsoft very much just did with picking up not only Bethesda, but Activision Blizzard as well. There is that upside, but that's business. So that's where we are so far with the long 18-month story for the Activision Blizzard acquisition. Thank you so much for watching this conversation. Hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all in my next video. You take it easy.